mentor of young scholars, and I was certainly no exception, although I sadly realized in writing this that young scholar has probably not been applicable for some time. Oh, shoot, I forgot I'm using two computers here. So I'll probably do this all. There you go, you can read that while I was going to post the whole article, but Bernard's work was already required reading in the Archaeology of Cyprus course I took during my undergraduate degree under David Rupp, who's there in the audience, at Brock University. Indeed, it was Bernard's current anthropology article on production, location, and integration in Bronze Age Cyprus that came out around that time and really piqued my interest not only in that place and time period, but indeed a way of approaching the past. And during my PhD at Toronto, I took a joint Ancient Interconnections in the Ancient Eastern Mediterranean course, which had several guest instructors, including David. I wrote a couple of papers on the ideological aspects of the late Bronze Age Cypriot economy. David suggested I send them to Bernard, and to my surprise at the time, he very quickly sent detailed feedback and, more importantly, a healthy dose of encouragement. And Bernard went on to serve as the external on my dissertation committee and the ever-patient editor of the MMA series, a decision he's probably long since come to regret. And it's coming at some point. And perhaps equally important, as a consummate host during some of the finest meals I've enjoyed in Cyprus. And so long may he continue to provide food for both mind and stomach. It's fair to say that Bernard has managed to contribute to our understanding of many of the central issues raised by the material record of prehistoric and protohistoric Cyprus. What I want to do today is to pick up a few threads woven by our honoree that address the materiality, meaning, and use of things in late Bronze Age Cyprus. I'll focus to some extent on the built environment, but will link them to other more portable types of material culture and explore how we might get at how people and things were entangled during social occasions, potentially allowing a more nuanced understanding of human material interactions and their implications for late Bronze Age social dynamics. Is that better? Sorry. Yes. Okay. An agency of things? Question mark. I had written early on in my investigations of late Bronze Age monumental architecture of the active role that built environments play in the constitution of society, using Giddens, Lefebvre, Bordeaux, and others to highlight the recursive relationship between agency and social production and reproduction, and particularly the spatiality of human action and interaction. As the locales, to use Giddens' term, in which actors' social lives typically play out, built environments clearly have a key role in these processes. A key role, to be sure, but is it really an active one? Considering this question forces us to engage with current debates about the agency of things, and particularly with materiality, which attempts to capture the dynamic process of human material relations. Even the choice of what to call the inhabitants of the material world is loaded in such debate, or indeed whether we even have a separate material world. While human agency has become fairly widely integrated into archaeological discourse, the idea that things, a more neutral term than object perhaps, including built environments, also have agency has only recently gained more traction. Apodorai's 1986 volume, The Social Life of Things, Commodities in Cultural Perspective, is often cited as a progenitor of such a view in arguing that things, like people, have social lives. The symmetrical archaeology espoused by Webmore and Whitmore and others represents perhaps the extreme end of such a position, suggesting that every being, human or material, can equally be seen as a differentiated thing, and thus raising the specter of an essentially peopleless study of material culture. Such approaches imbue material things with capacity for action, and in some cases with the potential for nearly autonomous intentionality. Critics have, of course, emphasized intentionality as one of the unique characteristics of human agency. Or, as an exasperated colleague texted me after I mentioned the paper I was working on, if things have agency, why isn't the laundry folding itself? As the father of a 1-year-old, I say, why not indeed? Recent and more serious ruminations on these subjects by Knapp have given me pause to think further about materiality, the agency of things, and their implications in my ongoing investigations of placemaking and the social dimensions of past built environments. In a paper titled The Way Things Are, published in 2018 in the John Cherry Festschrift, Knapp advocated a more moderate approach that emphasizes the need to focus on interactions amongst, humans, other living beings, and things, each with their own particular affordances. Derived from Gibson, affordances refer to a thing's potential as defined by the relational material properties. The material features of an object may afford its use for certain activities, but it is a human agent who decides which feature to use and how. Quoting Robb, Knapp sees agency then as, quote, fundamentally material, in that material things mediate and form the context for relationships between people, and because people form important relations with material things, end quote. He further argues that accepting that things have agentive capacities does not obviate human agency in manipulating or managing the material world. Material agency is perhaps as good a term as any to distinguish the agentive capacities of things. As Knappett and Malaforis argue, material agency is concerned not with trying to change the locus of agency from humans to materials, but rather with considering materials as critical in examining processes of agency. While objects are the intentional products of human action or design, they are actively implicated in social life in that they may act as agents by directing human use and maintenance. The agency of things is a product of both their properties, objective or at least measurable characteristics relating to its composition, appearance, or feel, but also qualities which are subjective and imposed by human actors and include notions such as value and meaning. How do built environments act as material agents? I turn now to a consideration of some particular monumental built environments from late Bronze Age Cyprus, which I've previously argued served as context for interaction among humans through which late Cypriot social dynamics were enacted, particularly those connected with the materialization of power relations, social boundaries, and identities. Here I am interested specifically in the materiality of these spaces and how the properties and qualities of their components contributed to placemaking. This leads to further consideration of how we might achieve a more nuanced understanding of the social lives of things by analyzing how these interactions, which involve various people and things, might have played out. While all people, past or present, engage with a variety of things in daily practice, I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that, at least since the beginning of sedentary life, built environments, from spaces within buildings to humanly modified landscapes, have had a particularly important role to play in social life. The largest of things, their sheer size and near omnipresence, makes their physicality all but possible to ignore. Nearly all of our interactions with other human and material actors take place within or in reference to the boundaries they create. As much as they are products of human agency, buildings at the same time exhibit material agency by dividing and ordering space, thereby structuring and routinizing the movements and social interactions of daily practice and playing a direct and active role in social reproduction. The materiality of built environments is intimately tied to their role as places. Lived space, as Lefebvre put it, imbued with meanings, identities, and memories that actively shape and are shaped by daily practice and the experiences of its inhabitants and historically contingent social processes. I have argued in some previous publications that late Cypriot built environments were the product of the placemaking activities of Cypriots at multiple scales, from the top-down planning of ruling elites, materialized in the massive walls and gridded streets of sites like Ankami, to mid-level interactions at the neighborhood or district scale that may represent particular communities, to bottom-up actions of individuals and households, which at times undermined or resisted the intentions of their rulers. You know what's going to happen? There you go, another slide finally. During the fully, all right. During the fully urban period of the mid-14th through 13th centuries, monumental buildings in urban centers replaced the funerary realm as the primary arenas in which social dynamics were enacted. To understand how this played out, how particular people and places were entangled, it is first necessary to isolate the places in which particular social interactions occurred. I analyzed a number of these buildings using an integrative approach that combined a suite of methods aimed at identifying likely locations for social interactions that were public inclusive or private exclusive in nature. The approach uses access analysis to examine how built environments influence movement and interaction potential through the configuration of their constituent spaces and by encoding and non-verbally communicating meanings that are perceived by their occupants and visitors, potentially influencing their behavior. I have emphasized the importance of public inclusive spaces as venues for social occasions, such as feasting and ritual activities, through which social roles and identities were negotiated and enacted. While I've previously argued for the significance of Ashlar Masonry as a component of late Cypriot monumentality and as a symbol of elite identity, I've recently turned my attention to the materiality of cut stone, as well as other components of monumental construction and how how the interplay of material properties and qualities produce meaningful context for social life. Perhaps the most emblematic element of late Cypriot monumental construction was ashlar masonry, ranging from the most elaborate type with large orthostat blocks sitting on plinths with drafted margins and lifting bosses to smaller rectangular blocks. My earlier work has shown that it tended to be deployed strategically, with the most elaborate types limited to the largest monumental structures and used where they would be most visible. It was such an effective means of materializing elite identity because it encoded and communicated a number of overlapping layers of meaning tied to its materiality and how it was produced and consumed. At its most basic, ashlar masonry symbolized elite control over material and human resources. In a forthcoming publication, I've taken a chaîne opératoire approach to examining the materiality of ashlar construction, attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events through which it was created and used. The extant masonry, combined with recovered tools and debitage, as well as provenience studies by Xenophontos and more recently Philokyprou, provide some insight into this process. It was a process that demonstrates an intimate knowledge of the technical properties and aesthetic qualities of stone, beginning with the selection of source material. The affordances offered by particular stone sources were clearly contributed to their desirability as quarries. At Kalavasos Ias and Moroni Vornes, ashlar masonry was made from calcareous sandstone from the Patna geological formation. Here at a former quarry in Tokni, about 4 kilometers northwest of KAD, we can see the natural layering and discontinuities in the Patna formation, which lends itself to easy removal of rectangular pieces of stone, including some that were exceptionally long. Such natural planes in the source material undoubtedly influenced and constrained the size of many ashlar blocks, although this needs further quantitative study. The blocks were roughed out at the quarry with lifting bosses and then transported to the building site where they were finished. As Cypriot ashlar construction was usually shell construction, the blocks were only finished along visible or directly adjoining surfaces. In the most elaborate form of masonry, this meant cutting back along a narrow margin through which adjoining blocks could be aligned, leaving a raised central panel. Whatever its practical functions, this became an important stylistic element of Cypriot ashlar masonry. At KAD, for instance, the central panel and lifting bosses were left roughly finished with obvious tool marks. I have argued that this acted as a mnemonic device, symbolizing the process of monumental construction and hence elite control of that process. It materialized the possibly distant place from which these blocks came, the labor that was required to quarry and move them to the site, and the technical and managerial expertise needed to make a building with them. It is a phenomenon akin to cutaway images used by car makers to show the complex engineering beneath the sleek metal skin. Here, too, the affordances of the stone itself may have played a role in the final appearance, with the softer sandstone more easily lending itself to the creation of deep tool marks, which, with the retained lifting bosses, enhance the visual saliency of the masonry through the interplay of light and shadow during changing lighting conditions. The orthostats from Temple Wanakitian, by contrast, made from the harder, whitish-colored reef limestone from the Coronia Formation, lent themselves to a smooth, fully dressed, highly reflective surface. Deployed in the facades of monumental buildings and urban settings, ashlar masonry was therefore an essential component of elite placemaking and a highly visible and effective means of materializing elite identity and urbanity. In a world where mud brick in various stages of decay was an ever-present part of daily life, the seeming permanence of cut stone masonry, and indeed the underlying social order through which it was constructed, undoubtedly sent a powerful message. Indeed, as Marshall McLuhan famously put it, the medium is the message. This was enhanced by the foreign associations of ashlar masonry, which signaled membership in a wider koine that helped further legitimize elite social position and authority. While the origins of Cypriot ashlar masonry are seen as being off-island, there is less agreement on the place of origin, with Syria often mentioned, but influences from other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean also acknowledged. Wright has noted the likely futility of pinpointing the origins of Cypriot ashlar masonry and argues that at its height of use in the late Cypriot 2C and 3A, it was its own creation using basic masonry devices common to a broad stylistic koine. This highlights the globalized nature of late Bronze Age ashlar masonry, and I would agree with Hitchcock's assertion that we should view it within the context of a broadened definition of the international style. suggest that we might then see the creation of monumental buildings as an example of globalization, as Cypriot elites drew upon both local tradition, such as the pie-shaped or courtyard house, and architectural elements of the globalized Eastern Mediterranean koine, such as Ashlar Masonry, adapting them to facilitate new local modes of social organization and interaction. The materiality of Ashlar Masonry therefore made it a most effective means of encoding and communicating multivalent meanings relating to elite power, identity, and monumentality. I would even go so far as to suggest that such a symbolically charged material may have been perceived as animate by those who encountered it in daily practice. We might see the foundation deposits of some late Bronze Age monumental buildings, such as the Ashlar building at Enkemi, as an effort to ritually activate or animate such structures. The ethnographic record abounds with examples of stones being perceived as animate objects, growing, procreating, and moving around, or even being ancestors. Of course, Ashlar Masonry was not deployed in isolation, but in concert with other things whose material properties and qualities contributed to the creation of a place. We might take a similar approach to other elements of the built environment. I very briefly consider two such things here. Plaster was a significant component of the late Bronze Age built environment, and its deployment in various forms on walls, floors, and roads was a product of both technical requirements and social meaning. Its application over earth, stone, and mud brick transformed spaces, giving them different visual, tactile, and acoustic properties. Yet plaster technology and its social implications remain largely understudied for Bronze Age Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean more generally. New archaeological work conducted by the Cambi project at Kalavasos Dimitros is aimed at obtaining high-resolution data on urban placemaking, and has included the analysis of various plaster surfaces using micromorphology and other methods. Excavation and electromagnetic induction survey carried out in Building 16, a large court-centered building west of Building 15, are providing converging lines of evidence for feasting activities. Such activities may have taken place in Room 1, the bench-lined central court of Building 16, the plaster floor of which contrasts with the earthen floor of the adjoining Room 2 to the north. We excavated a narrow sondage through this plaster surface along the face of the northern bench, which revealed a series of thin white plaster surfaces underlying the topmost, interspersed with thicker layers of sediment. Micromorphology analysis identified 11 such surfaces composed of pyrogenic lime plaster with layers of crushed calcite and sediment fill in between, indicating a regular program of renewal over the course of Building 16's use life. Our analyses so far also indicate that even among pyrogenic lime plaster surfaces, different recipes were used in different contexts to create specialized surfaces in a scale and complexity that went beyond structural requirements, suggesting that these surfaces were constructed with explicit intent for creating space imbued with social meaning. Given its ubiquity, mud, and particularly mud brick, would be easy to dismiss as not having any significance beyond the practical function it typically served. In one of the few studies of the social meaning of mud brick, Love sees mud brick construction in Neolithic Anatolia as public performance and suggests that the manufacture and transportation of mud bricks was part of this. The time and labor expense is derived from an entangled, multi-phase production cycle requiring several locations, people, tools, materials, forethought, preparation, and time. Love further argues that mud brick manufacture and construction was, quote, actively performed in the public sphere where the production and consumption of bricks became one venue to make a social statement, end quote. Certainly vast volumes of mud brick were required for late Cypriot monumental structures such as Building 10 or Building 16 at KAD. A team making mud bricks for reconstructing walls at the Hittite capital of Hattusha used 10 cubic meters of water to produce 500 to 600 bricks, and concluded that it would have been foolhardy for the Hittites to move that amount of water required to make the bricks. Instead, it would have been easier to make the bricks close to a water source and then transport the dry bricks to the building site. While the mud brick in monumental buildings was rendered largely invisible by plaster, the process of mud brick production and construction was likely one of the more visible components of monumental building. During the construction of the northeast area at KAD, one might, for example, envision a nearly continuous procession of bricks between the Vasilikos River and the building site. In addition, some preliminary analysis of mud brick samples from Building 10 at KAD, literally conducted yesterday or the day before, this is fresh stuff here, by Rachel Kulik, our geoarchaeologist, indicates that unlike plaster, mud brick appears to have a fairly consistent composition across multiple contexts such as superstructures and partition walls, which might point to a more centralized production. In the interest of time, I've left wood, sorry Brita, which is also, of course, quite important. The layers of meaning encoded in these materials were communicated to various audiences through placemaking, the entanglement of these things with people in contexts for social interactions, during which, in this case, elite and community identities could be negotiated and displayed. I now end with a brief consideration of how this might have played out on the ground. As we've established, material things mediate and form the context for relationships between people, and that people form important relations with material things. Isolating likely contexts in which people could interact with one another and with things gets us part of the way to understanding these processes, but can we go further to reconstruct how particular interactions might have occurred? I conclude by taking some preliminary steps in this direction, focusing on a particular event that likely took place in Building 10 at KAD towards the end of the LC2C period. From Allison South's excavations at KAD, some of you will be familiar with the unique deposit recovered in room 173 in a deep rectangular shaft that may have been a well or latrine. Within its fill was a deposit that contained, in addition to numerous botanical remains, 4.5 kilograms of animal bones, including large numbers of meat-bearing joints of sheep and goat. The impressive ceramic assemblage contained some wall bracket fragments and lamps, but otherwise consisted of at least 85 fineware vessels with Mycenaean and local Mycenaean imitations comprising at least 62% of the assemblage, and imports making up about 75% of that amount. While few of the vessels were complete, most were broken but restorable, with joins being found at distinctly different depths, suggesting that the material was deposited in a few episodes over a short time, or possibly even all at once. Both South and myself have argued that the purposeful destruction and deposition of this material may have been an act of conspicuous consumption that marked the end of a feasting event, or possibly events, according to South, that most likely took place in Building 10 Central Court. But what might such an event have looked like? As I have argued previously, feasts were social occasions through which power dynamics were enacted, and social difference could be either emphasized or downplayed. Yet more than this, they were dynamic, embodied performances that engaged multiple senses and brought people and things into focused interplay. Microtheater is, to use Hodder's term. The central court of Building 10 was undoubtedly an impressive space, 2 stories high and largely lined with Ashlar Masonry, supporting a plastered mud brick superstructure. The cedar beams of a balcony or balconies were supported by large, possibly ashlar columns, leaving the court partially open to the sky. Its pebbled surface stood in contrast to the plaster floors of the surrounding spaces. As an important connective space, the central court was undoubtedly a place used for various functions on daily or seasonal cycles, but it was also well suited as a venue for ceremonial feasting. Having come up the city's main north-south road, guests would have undoubtedly entered through Building 12 and the impressive vestibule and its sets of antithetically placed ashlar slabs, marking the transition to a symbolically charged space. Following Rappaport, we might further expand the definition of the built environment and its agentic properties beyond these fixed feature elements. We also need to understand the semi-fixed features, portable furnishings and artifacts, and non-fixed feature elements, which include the physical and verbal expressions of the building's occupants and users, including their language, clothing, and accessories. Other than the ceramic and food assemblage, we have little direct evidence for either of these. In the absence of built-in benches, as we have recovered in Building 16 at KAD, we assume that some other kind of chair or stool was used for seating. Objects like this miniature bronze chair from Schiffer's excavations at Enkemi provide some indication. Images from cylinder seals, while often highly schematic, are also suggestive of possible seating configurations. One such seal deposit depicts 2 robed individuals holding a cup in one hand and some form of scepter or weapon, possibly an axe, in the other, and there's a few other examples here. Using modern architectural conventions, this nearly 100 square meter space could hold up to 180 seated persons, although in reality this would be much less, taking into account the size of tables and the central columns, as well as perhaps the exclusivity of the event itself. This raises the issue of how interaction at such distances was perceived by the participants. Hall pioneered research into personal space and developed the field of proxemics, the study of people's use of space as an aspect of culture. Based on his observations of several cultural groups, he concluded that there were 4 distinct distances ranging from intimate, personal, social, and public, at which various types of interaction took place and which affected human sensory perception. Certainly, interactions across this entire range were possible within Building 10's central court. If, however, we take the feasting imagery as representative, we might expect that interactions were largely taking place within the personal to near social ranges during which the details of one's attire were clearly visible. This included many of the objects that eventually ended up in burials: headgear, rings, earrings, pectorals, armbands, things that signaled one's personal identity, social rank within the local elite group, and perhaps also participation in a wider Eastern Mediterranean koine, indicated by objects of foreign manufacture or with hybridized iconography. At such distances, makeup and the smell of scented oils are also powerful indicators of one's identities. We should also consider engagement with the feasting assemblage itself. It should not surprise us that a crater or craters was missing from the collection of fine wares broken and placed in the deposit in Building 10. Imported Mycenaean pictorial craters were an essential piece of Cypriot elite feasting equipment. More than mere exotica, they were often decorated with chariot procession scenes, iconography explicitly associated with members of a warrior elite or ruling class throughout the Aegean and Near East. Furthermore, such craters were a required part of a proper elite funerary assemblage in the late Cypriot urban centers, and a use-ware study by Kazwani reveals that these vessels were used over a long period before being deposited. Steele suggests that craters were carefully curated and only used on specific occasions such as ceremonial feasts. Some preliminary experiments that UBC MA student Jem Tari and I conducted, displaying the iconography of a few such craters on monitors and viewing them under various lighting conditions, suggest that the dark, usually dark brown, painted images against the light background would have been visible from any distance within Building 10 Central Court, particularly the chariot wheel and the solid painted bodies of the horses, which were made clearly legible at distances exceeding 15 meters. I'll conclude with a very brief introduction to some ongoing work that is attempting to use virtual reality to tie a number of these elements together as a means of investigating the built environment at KAD as it might have appeared during the Late Bronze Age. The work is being conducted by Jem Tari and a team from the Center for Digital Media in Vancouver and is funded through my involvement in the Computational Research on the Ancient Near East, or CRANE project. This particular VR project is serving as a sandbox for us to explore the capacity of VR to serve as a tool for data integration and to collect data on movement, visibility, and soundscapes within the buildings at KAD. I didn't want to run the risk of running a live demo, so I just have a few screenshots, but I can show people who are interested perhaps afterwards. But you can see here a preliminary attempt to recreate a feast using lighting, furniture, and artifact types and arrangements, some of which borrowed from other sites to fill in the gaps. Here's the VR model entering Building 10 through the entry hall. You can see the twin sets of ashlar slabs as you move in. You may recognize, some of you, the bronze brazier found at Sinda, which has been placed in the central hall. Here's an example. Fire is often associated with these feasting activities. We've set up a table with some of the actual artifacts found at KAD and some actually from the British Museum, the UBC Museum of Anthropology, which has a rather nice, if small, Cypriot collection. And a few more views as we attempt to sort of play with the lighting, assuming perhaps an evening sort of event. And but as I said, this serves as a sandbox by which we can try and play with various spatial configurations. And we've also got it set so that you can toggle on and off various degrees of certainty about the various things that were found in there. You can also call up additional information. You can export PDFs from this on these various artifacts. And there you go. This is actually the one of the ones found from the tombs, one of the tombs at KAD, and. I'll leave it at that, I think, at this point, other than to say that it is difficult to overstate the importance of the contributions our honoree has made to debates on the material world of Late Bronze Age Cyprus and the wider Mediterranean, and to note that this is not bad for a guy who, when visiting University of Toronto during a certain PhD defense and visiting the archaeology lab, was heard to utter, and I'm getting the second hand and I'm probably paraphrasing a bit, quote, "I'm not really interested in material culture." End quote. Thank you.
Thank you. I will allow one short question. If you
I know it was a bit long,
like
I realize.
Bernard.
I don't remember that statement, but I wouldn't put it past me. But let me just ask you, do you think people in the ancient world spent all their time having a feast? Is there any way you could try and introduce another term, like ceremonial activities, or, I raised this issue with David yesterday, and I'll continue to raise it every time I hear the word feast. Thank you.
It is overused, I would agree. And I think, yes, it probably is standing in for what was probably a much a larger variety of activities that involved consumption of food and probably other ritual activities, but point taken.
In the interest of our ritual feasting at lunchtime, thank you very much, Kevin.
Cheers.
Okay. Just about. Thank you. Our next speaker is a PhD student of Bernard's, so a fairly direct descendant relationship here. Anne Brisbart's